Where to begin here? The issue of public policy seems to be the underpinnings for the sex offender registry and for the so-called proactive sex stings that police routinely engage in order to garner the statistics they need to claim that they're rooting out child exploitation and predation. Of course, as I pointed out on this channel, there's any number of times that they are failing to do that right in their midst. And most particularly, they're failing to, by getting the low hanging fruit, they're failing to really deal with the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is not men going on dating sites which cater to adults, engaging in platforms where they're looking for adults, and not saying anything about children, and then being baited, cajoled, coerced, pressured, pushed, and suggested by law enforcement who are pimping profiles of children to entice these people. Those are not the problems. The police are the problems on those, not universally individuals. And that's not to say that individual citizens don't do their fair share of cruddy things, but I'd like to see the statistics that say that citizens, which far outnumber police officers, do this far more often than police officers and prosecutors and others in positions of power and authority more than a citizen abuse those opportunities. I want to see that study. Maybe you have it, trolls. But in the meantime, we have a number of studies which suggest that the public policy issue is a perception issue that our government is engaging in to allow the citizenry, without any attempt to dissuade them, to believe that predation is so out of control that it is covered, protected, mitigated, made better in some way by these proactive stings. The problem is, whenever we try to solve a problem in this country, what we do is we end up with the pendulum swing. Way too far one way, way too far another. We also have not come to terms with just the truth, which is if a killer kills your loved one, keeping them in prison costs money. It may make you feel slightly better. Your vengeance is satisfied and satiated in some way, but it's never going to bring your loved one back. Is there rehabilitation possibilities, or is it a Charles Manson sort of thing? In most cases, there's a rehabilitation process. And when one is rehabilitated, it not only heals the person in prison, it also heals the other person who is the victim of this, or relation to the victim adjacent, let's say. There is some research on that. But what's really, really telling here is that we don't push that so much in our public policy. So we're treated in Virginia, as we were last year, to an attempt to mitigate or vitiate to some extent the amount of time that people with capital crimes or related crimes in Virginia prisons would have an opportunity after some 20 years of incarceration to get out on a probation, get out on a parole, or just to petition a judge to get out. And people lined up. A hearing that they had hoped to go 20 minutes went hours as people tearfully got up there. And with anger and hatred, that person needs to stay in and never be allowed to get out ever again. Because he took my husband, my child, my this, my that, my she did this, she did. It doesn't matter, folks. I sat there watching the whole thing, taking notes. The pain in these people's lives, I had every sympathy for. But after 10 or 12 or 7 or 8 or 20 years, it still hadn't gone away. I guess it's not going to go away. And incarcerating them is not going to make it better. So even after 20 years, we can't find a way to make this better. We can't find a better way. Well, I'm going to show you some articles that indicate that public perception is very often wrong. And we're still making the same damn mistakes over and over and over again. Not only is nobody but us standing up against the police saying that these sex stings, the proactive trolling now, is harming people. Nobody's saying if you have a hot tip and there's an 11-year-old in a basement locker somewhere that shouldn't take action. Nobody's saying that. But when you're out there trolling and baiting people, and for the trolls, whether you talk to somebody who's a minor or disengage right away, you're still arrested. Listen to my videos. Stop telling me I don't know what I'm talking about. Stop looking at one tiny sliver and assuming you understand the rest. So let me show you some videos here of what's really going on out there, right? And this is really extraordinary. I'm going to start with this one here. This is out of Woodstock, New York. The Woodstock Town Board votes to fire employee found to be sex offender in explosive meeting. Actually, it should be the Woodstock Town Board in an explosive meeting votes to fire employee found to be a sex offender. That would be proper grammar. It sounds like they found out he was a sex offender in the meeting, which is not exactly the case, although that certainly was news to some people. Bottom line here, folks, is they hired a tier 3, a top of the line, considered most violent sex offender as a custodian. They then moved to rescind that hire, fire him, 31 years of age, level 3. And what did he do? Well, he abused an unconscious woman, sexually abused her, and convicted of possessing child pornography involving an 11-year-old girl. Not cool, not what we want. He's on the state sex offender registry for life. Okay? And some of the board members said, look, let's be a state that gives second chances. We won't put him in a position where he'll be around children. Well, it turns out, of course, that's hard to do. And he was working on a pool, cleaning it, and there were some children supposedly within sight or nearby or in an adjacent building, right, where both minor employees and campers were present. We don't know if they were outside, if they were in a building. Doesn't matter, but people lost their shit, of course, right? And of course, people said that, oh, I find it horrifying. We've got to deal with this. And some people claimed in here, and I'm looking for where it says, somebody was saying that they were victim of sex abuse themselves. Trying to find it here somewhere. Anyway, they referred to it as a triggering event in one article I read. So that's a thing. Okay, so I'm being triggered, therefore you should remove this. Well, I got a problem against triggers. Everything can be triggering potentially. Everything. Every ugly event can be triggered by a sight, a smell, somebody who looks similar. I once had a meeting I was called into because a difficult female student in my class kept making sexual jokes, and I kept calling her out on that. We went down and saw the parent. The parent was wearing a Gucci, can you believe it? A Gucci wrist and forearm band, which happened to match the one her daughter was wearing that morning. And this woman was talking to somebody. When I walked in, I was introduced. She turned to face me. And when she was introduced to me, she said, "Oh, Mr. Asian, you remind me of someone. Oh, my third ex-husband. And I really hated him." And I looked at her, blinked a couple of times, shook her hand slightly, dropped it, and said, "Well, I'm not quite sure where to go from there." The point is that anything is a trigger potentially. And are we going to make our public policy based on the so-called triggers? Is that what we're going to do? Are we going to make that our beacon here, the so-called trigger? Is that going to be our particular bugaboo here? Or are we going to be concerned about something a little different, right? Well, this does matter. It turns out, to no great surprise, I'm pulling this down to see where I'm going to do it, that there is some factors which affect your perception in the public. Factors in impacting this, and this comes out of the CUNY, City University of New York, John Jay College, and the role of conservatism and knowledge. In other words, conservatism being how you view yourself, family rights candidates, family values candidates, I'm sorry. And if you look at this, it will come as no surprise. Maybe I can increase this here a little bit. That sex offender legislation is influenced by public pressure, not by rules of engagement and what has been found to work in a community, not by deterrence programs, not by the research, certainly not by what intelligent, thoughtful people believe, or what research by nonpartisan, non judgmental groups that just are scientists wanting to know what's going on. Well, they're not influenced by that. There is evidence suggesting, I love this line because it to me is the example of Laitochi's deliberate understatement to make a point. There is evidence that suggesting that the public's beliefs about sex offenders may be based upon myths and misperceptions. No kidding. The study examined the relationship between knowledge of sex offenders and areas concerning their recidivism rates, treatment outcomes, etc., and all this other stuff, and how this relates to overall attitudes. We sought to examine how conservative belief systems affect the relationships. We looked at 559 undergraduate students who had knowledge about sex offense and conservative beliefs, and their conservative beliefs as just one belief level, because liberals are not super on the side of people who are the most stigmatized, that be sex offenders. So they just chose conservatives, found that these belief structures and what they're hearing around them significantly affected how they believed. And by the way, this study is about 8 years old, but still recent enough, and with our current understanding prescient enough, that we could clearly see some patterns in people's behavior and their beliefs. If they hear it enough, they will believe it, as Mr. Trump has proved. So why aren't we saying the truth enough, and they'll believe that too? Sex offenders, reading from the study's introduction, are often perceived as the most despised offenders within the criminal justice system. And by the way, this includes other advocacy groups for criminal justice reform. They also won't have anything to do with sex offenders because presumably they work so hard in their area, they don't want even a little something dragging them down. And as somebody who's worked with Tammy Goodson and others who have worked with these other groups, helping their priorities, I can tell you when it comes turn for you to ask for a favor, they get busy getting away from you as quickly as they can. The notion that sex offenders have very high recidivism rates, for example, my editorializing there, and that strangers, reading further, commit most sex crimes is in actuality the contrary being true. Sex offenders have some of the lowest recidivism rates of all offender types. And look at all of the studies that bear this out just over the last 20 years. Okay? Now, you can run into studies that talk about recidivism rates, and I've talked about that too, and it really depends on how you slice that rates. But as a general rule, no, it does not help a damn thing. Okay? There is no great benefit from the sex offender registration either. Okay? Even though research has suggested there's a substantial support for sex offender registration and notification policies because people think it does some good. What if they were told all the time that it does little to no good? What if that were the case? We ran into this when I was a kid with smoking. We heard over and over again smoking was bad. There were anti-smoking programs, a huge government well-funded apparatus, and guess what happened? We had a healthier society because we weren't smoking. All right. I'm going to post this in the video description down below. But I just, it's that's the message, is to make sure that we are constantly on message, telling the truth. Cops could then go on and solve other problems, such as grand larceny. Huge problem. Okay. Real trafficking abroad. Real sex rings in the United States, as opposed to an innocent person who just wants to get laid by going on an adult sex site. So we can look at other areas too where this destructive behavior works worldwide in public perception. Let's look at this. The Salford primary school teacher who was banned after failing to declare her relationship with a child sex offender. This is fascinating, right? This is fascinating. So this woman, 36, had her teaching license suspended indefinitely because she failed to disclose to the school that she was actually in a relationship with person A who had child sex offenses. She admitted she was in a relationship with that person, but no longer, for about a year. She did not break up with him because she found out he was on the registry. She broke up with him because that was the natural course of the relationship. She did not disclose it, frankly, because it was none of their damn business, and she was under no duty to do so under law or otherwise. Okay? She denied her relationship, her conduct in not disclosing amounted to unprofessionalism. Okay? Or brought the teaching profession into disrepute. Folks, I taught for 35 years. I could point to drunk teachers, lying, and abusive administrators, people who are having relationships with students or suspected of having to do that, but because they did it quietly and they knew the right people and they married soon after the person went from age 70 to 18, all was forgotten and forgiven. In fact, some of those people would come to our faculty meetings, right? This is really extraordinary where you put your efforts. That's what I'm saying. She didn't have a duty to report it, and she's been suspended anyway. Okay? That's what's so extraordinary about this. Okay? If you want to talk about somebody who should, I want to point out one other thing. So, there is a county apparently in Florida that decided that what they're going to do is start registering. It was Marion County, I think it is, or Martin County, in Florida, that decided it would start registering the children of registrants. Now, apparently, this is done in another state. I'm trying to remember where. Might be Tennessee, might be somewhere farther out west. But under what authority are you registering the people known to the so-called registrant, the so-called sex offender who is forced to register? His registrant status is a fact of law. What does that got to do with his kids? His home is registered. What'd the home do? By the way, when you leave the home, it's also registered. His car is registered. What'd the car do? His job is registered. In Virginia, you have to do stupid things. For example, here in the state, and every state has its own stupid sort of regulations. You get 5 years on the renewal of your driver's license, not 8 years, because, of course, that makes the public safe somehow. It's insanity. And so it is this woman in the UK I just indicated, because this is a worldwide phenomenon of pressing out fear-mongering public policy instead of fact-based, scientific-based, intelligent public policy. So we're going to register children now, huh? What's next? What's next? You can make the argument that anything is adjacent to the person who's an offender. Maybe they should be required to pay for groceries to be delivered to their house so they don't go to grocery stores, because children sometimes are in grocery stores accompanying their parents. And sometimes, if they're old enough, they're and it's near school, they go in there and they pick up snacks and stuff like that, right? Maybe we should not allow that. How about restaurants? Sometimes there are children in restaurants and they go to the bathroom, or movie theaters. No, maybe sex offenders should be in a box all day long. And guess what? You still will not solve the problem. For those of you in the troll community going, it still won't solve the problem, because that isn't the problem. You're looking for a solution where it does not exist. So here's an idea. Maybe we need to start training the public over and over again on the truth. On the truth. Okay? And yes, will sex offenses still occur? Sure. But you know what? Then we can look at a system that deals with that individual, getting them help. Maybe they need intensive psychological treatment instead of this stupid mamby-pamby psych system where if you argue with them, they declare that you must be a narcissist. And when you demand that they do and because they claim, as is an element of narcissism, a lack of empathy for your victim, which is hilarious when you don't have a victim, A, and B, when you have a history of empathy for children. And yet they want to make that argument until you call them on their bluff and you say, well, gee, you ought to get that narcissism paperwork and get those tests done immediately. And then they will. It didn't exactly say you were. I mean, you had ideations, leaning toward it, whatever. Okay. The fact of the matter is that we are seeing a ridiculousness where fear-driven policies are making things worse and worse in places like Tennessee and Florida, and any place where the conservative side or the MAGA side lives. But I'm not giving liberals a pass. We have a governor candidate, excuse me, an Abigail Spanberger, who many liberals will probably vote for, even though a few years ago she had a YouTube video saying so she could get elected in a conservative area. She runs the gamut from conservative to liberal. Probably would be in the old conservative Democrat mold. That this ad said, I'll protect your kids from the pedophiles and the sex offenders. We tried to meet with her. She refused. Maybe if I were in her shoes, I would too. We had some real hard questions for her when she was our representative. But of course, she doesn't want to meet with us because she might have to answer. But by the way, folks, we vote. We do vote. There are places that are not allowing us to vote, but there are other places that do allow us to vote. And we vote. Just keep that in mind. We also pay taxes, folks. We pay taxes and we vote, right? So we got this going on here. But just in case you wonder exactly where, I guess I better share my screen. I'm off kilter here. In case you're wondering exactly where the abusers are, and if you could tell, if you have a list, you can always tell this, right? No, you can't. The list doesn't do anything. How about this one? Again, returning to Great Britain, prison officer who led sex offenders rehab found with child abuse material. You mean to tell me that somebody who's in charge of the so-called sex offenders rehab program would have one of the largest stashes of child porn ever? Right. This guy, Mr. Sugden. I hope he's not related to the famous British actress Molly Sugden, the late Molly Sugden, who was terrific in Are You Being Served in the late 60s and 1970s. Hopefully, no relation. But in any event, prison officer who delivered rehabilitation courses to people accused of sex offenses, that's how it should be written, has been placed on a register himself after being found with child abuse material and extreme pornography, including bestiality. A woman having sex with a donkey. Well, I guess that's not real pedophilia, is it? That's bestiality. Oh, good God. So in Falkirk, it was raided by police, his house in June. He was caught in a sting set up by so-called pedophile hunters. That's a whole new program, the vigilantes setting people up. Well, I suppose we should be grateful, although it's not certain, according to the research, that Mr. Sugden acted on any of this as a result of having those stashes. And that's another issue, too. Do you want people preying on your children, or would you rather they do their sick fantasies in their homes? You cannot modify all behavior. Folks, I know people who are alcoholics, who are food and beverage managers in restaurants and bars, bartenders who are incredible alcoholics. All right. They're not doing anybody any favors, and yet we're not doing anything about them because doesn't have the word called sex, online, and child somewhere in the heading of a tax piece article. So here we have he's 46 years of age. He pled guilty at a hearing. Okay. And he supposedly was communicating indecently with somebody believed to be called Abby, who, of course, was an adult female decoy. And again, just because you're communicating, folks, doesn't mean that you would actually do something. There is some evidence to suggest that that doesn't necessarily translate to meeting. But in any event, my point here is largely you never can tell. This is a person in position of trust, like all those police officers in the Washington Post last summer, 2024 summer, um, five-part series, I think it was, Betrayed by the Badge, in which police officers use their badge to get into the pants of girls about this age. And of course, you never know. So since you never know exactly what's going to happen, this guy was apparently a happily married man who had two children of his own. Okay. And that he has now been put in a position where he is one of the bad guys too. And again, I'm not saying he's a great guy. I'm not saying we let him off hook. He shouldn't get any penalty. But we need to understand, folks, that either we're going to have to take a new public stance toward this, and we start by taking the innocent people who are being railroaded by the police in trolling operations and vigilante attacks on people just because they happen to be publicly available on the registry. And maybe we clip those wings first. Maybe we do something like that because we never know. Mr. Sugden and many others who are in positions of authority, judges, police officers, prosecuting attorneys, we never know if they're the actual perpetrators or not. And since you can't know, you're basically left with two options. You suspect everybody, careful way instead, or you just say, we can't do anything. And if you say you can't do anything at all, that's throwing in the towel too. The pendulum swinging the opposite direction. We need to have a better public policy, and it starts with telling the public the truth about what really happens in these cases and what really is going on. And we develop children-centered programs that aren't involved in getting fear engendered in our children, but rather helping them mature and understand how to deal with people who might be interested in harming them and still at the same time respond to their environment in a healthy and reasonable way. This is Norman Michaelation with ICAC Unpacked. Have a good day.